In our previous video dealing with the different types of reasoning, I mentioned something called logical fallacies. And that is the focus of this video. Logical fallacies are basically errors in logic and reasoning that are easy to make if you're not careful. And what these various logical fallacies are and what you do when you commit them is the subject of this video. All right, so as I just said, logical fallacies are errors in logic and reasoning. And we all commit them. They're easy to do, but they're called logical fallacies because although they may sound good on the surface, there's a fundamental flaw, a fundamental bad concept rooted within an argument that's based on a logical fallacy. So let's look at the main ones and talk about what they are and how you can stay away from them. All right, so our first one is what's called the hasty generalization. Now, this most often occurs, if you remember, in our video about the types of reasoning, we discussed reasoning from specific instance, when you had individual examples and said, because I see this overarching pattern in these individual examples, I'm going to assume this overarching rule. Remember that? Okay. The hasty generalization is when you jump from those individual cases to an overarching rule without enough evidence to justify the jump. You don't have enough cases. You don't have enough explanation that basically nullifies the differences. That's what's called a hasty generalization. For example, think back to maybe when you were in high school or middle school, did you ever have one student do something stupid and as a result, everybody got punished? Kind of the same. You all are going to do this because this one moron did it. Well, that's kind of a hasty generalization. Another example, and I'm just as guilty of this as I'm sure several of you are. How many of y'all ever gone to a restaurant that you'd never been to before? You're going to try it out. 50-something things on the menu. You tried one. Didn't like it. Never went back. 50-something things on the menu you tried. You tried basically 2% of the entire food offerings and assumed that because that one you didn't like, you're not going to like anything else on the menu. Now, if you put it that way, does it make sense? No, it's a logical fallacy. Again, I'm just as guilty of it as I'm sure several of you are. There's a couple places I still won't go to because I had a bad experience, even though I teach this class, so I understand it. But that's why it's important to have that evidence that this number of cases you have can be used to make that overarching conclusion. Now, our next logical fallacy is called false cause. This is when you assume that cause and effect relationship between two things when you're using causal reasoning. And again, you don't have enough evidence to prove a cause and effect relationship. For example, if my wife and I went out tonight and bought a new mattress and woke up tomorrow morning and our car was stolen, we call the cops. How stupid would we sound telling the cops, well, our car got stolen because we bought a new mattress? It doesn't make any sense. What's the relationship there? And so that's the fallacy of false cause. It's just assuming a cause and effect relationship without really evidence to prove it. And our third one is what we call the invalid analogy. This, big surprise, is the primary logical fallacy you can commit when you're using analogical reasoning. And that's when you try to say these two things are similar and they're just not. There's not enough commonalities. There's not enough evidence to prove that they are essentially alike. And so you're trying to compare two things when you really shouldn't be. That's the invalid analogy. But there's now those three were kind of specific to one of those various types of reasoning, but there's other ones that you can fall into these traps in any type of reasoning. And you'll probably you probably have heard these used a lot. You probably have fell for them yourself a lot. And our first big one is what we call the bandwagon fallacy. What does this mean? All right, the bandwagon fallacy occurs that when you say, because something is popular, it's the right thing to do. Now, why is that? I can already hear some of you, well, why is that a fallacy? If it's what most people want, shouldn't we do it? And that's particularly if you grow up in the United States, we're a democracy. Most people voting, and that's how we tend to select our leaders and make big decisions. So it's understandable. The focus here is that if the only reason you have as to why we should do option A is because it's popular, that's not a reason. Popularity in and of itself is not evidence of a good idea. Why? Because the majority of people can be wrong for any number of reasons. Case in point, you probably heard of Prohibition when they outlawed alcohol in the United States. It was a popular idea at the time. I mean, it was a constitutional amendment. That just doesn't happen. It's got to go through several things to make sure people are okay with it. And the reason why people who were against alcohol were going for a constitutional amendment is there'd never been a constitutional amendment repealed until Prohibition, because after they passed it and people kind of saw what life was like after the fact, they said, yeah, this was a horrible idea. And then we repealed it. Now, can something be a good idea and popular? Absolutely. But popularity in and of itself is not a justification for an idea being considered good. All right? Something can be popular and a good idea, but just because it's popular does not automatically make it a good idea. And that's the bandwagon fallacy. Now, our next one is the red herring. Now, this tends to occur a little bit more in debates. But this is when you interject something irrelevant into a conversation to basically divert people's attention from the actual subject or substance you're talking about, all right? And this is my opinion, but in my observations of debates and so forth, I tend to see that when somebody throws out a red herring, it's typically because they know they're losing. It's one of the first things I look for in a debate for which side I think is losing, is who starts to go for this first, right? An example would be let's say I was running for mayor and I'm talking about, some kind of traffic policy I would implement. And then my opponent falling for this would say, well, I would expect that from somebody who wears glasses. Well, what does that have to do with anything? That's a red herring. It's introducing something irrelevant. All right. We're talking about tax policy, and all of a sudden you bring in like the car I drive. It doesn't make sense. All right. Now, our next one after this is what we call the ad hominem. Now, this is when you attack the person rather than the actual idea. And you can often people wind up committing a double logical fallacy because ad hominem attacks are often used as red herrings. Now, I want to be clear. Not all ad hominems are red herrings, and not all red herrings are ad hominems, okay? But they often do connect. Hope that made sense, okay? So like I said, an ad hominem is when you attack the person rather than the idea. Now, why is this considered a logical fallacy? I'll explain this simply. Can bad people have good ideas? Yes. Out of 100 ideas, 99 of them may have been horrible, but they could have one great one in there. And I'll give you an historical example. I'm sure many of you out there enjoy the use of the interstate highway system. Use it all the time. I use it almost every day. That is a good idea. The ability of it to connect our country together, the ability that it's had in creating a logistical network that's allowed companies to get their products to market a lot more efficient. It's been phenomenal for the growth and economic prosperity of our country. So interstate highway, good idea. Guess who came up with the idea? The Nazis. Yeah, the first ever interstate highway system was built in Germany under the Nazis. It was called the Autobahn. Now, Nazis, not a lot of good ideas at all, but this one was good. Eisenhower, when the Allied forces got into Germany and he saw how much this Autobahn benefited his troops in trying to get to that place, he thought, this is a good idea. And later when he became president, that's why he wanted to implement one, because he saw how effective they can be. So horrible people, but that's a good idea. All right. So you might want to say we shouldn't acknowledge this idea because the person who said it's an evil, wrong person, but even evil, wrong people have good ideas sometimes. So you need to stick to attacking the issues, not go after the person itself. And here again, often I find, like in a debate or often in political campaigns, the first side that goes towards ad hominems tends to be the side that's losing. So, yeah. Now, our next logical fallacy is what's referred to as the either or fallacy, okay? And this occurs when you take some sort of issue or decision and you boil it down as basically you have two options when lots of different options actually exist. And what also tends to happen when you commit this fallacy is you make one of the options sound so horrible, you'd have to be a moron to pick that option. Case in point. Now, mind you, I teach by choice at a 2-year community and technical college. I teach at a 2-year technical community college because it's where I started. It helped me a lot in getting ready to school, going and getting into college, and would be where I am today without going to a 2-year community technical college. But often, for example, high school students, when you talk about going to college, we don't get brought up. And how many of you remember talking to a guidance counselor or something, or maybe even your parents, and they presented the choice as, look, when you get out of school, out of high school, you got 2 choices. You can either go to college, get a degree, get out, get a great job, marry somebody hot and beautiful, and have a great family with a big house and a nice car, or you can not go to college and wind up addicted to drugs, living in a ditch, eating off rats you catch in the sewer. Now, what do you want, the big house and car or the sewer rats? One, you see how one of those options is deliberately being framed to be horrible? And two, are those the only 2 options? No, maybe you don't. Maybe a 4-year school's not for you. Maybe you want to come to a school like Gateway and get a certificate in like diesel mechanic or mechatronics or 3D printing or something like that. Maybe you need to take some time off. There's the military, there's internships, trade programs, apprenticeships, all these various things. And oftentimes what happens is when people try to frame something in an either or, it's a sideways way of trying to get people to pick a certain option. And again, the fallacy here is very rarely, if at all, is there just 2 options. There's other options out there and they just minimize them or don't even recognize them. Now, our next one is what's called the slippery slope fallacy. And this is a goodie. The slippery slope fallacy occurs when you say, if we take this one step, these are going to lead to these other steps that cannot be prevented, and the next thing you know, everything's going to be horrible. That's the slippery slope. Now, why is this a logical fallacy? Because on the surface, there does seem to be some credibility to it. For example, historically, back in the 1950s, church groups, civic groups, parent groups, politicians went crazy about Elvis Presley going on the Ed Sullivan Show and shaking his pelvis, because they said if we let him go on TV and shake his pelvis, next thing you know, we're going to have all kinds of crazy, lewd, lascivious acts happening everywhere. Have you seen reality TV? Kind of seems like there was some credence in what they were arguing. But here's the thing. What makes a slippery slope argument a logical fallacy is this step will lead to other steps that cannot be prevented. That is the fallacy part. All right. It's one thing to say this might set a precedent. It's one thing to say this could open the door and it's going to be hard to close. Then you're putting what we would call conditionality on it, saying, yeah, when we make this step, it might be make other ones in the future easier to take. And I'm not sure we want to go there. Remember, I'm saying might be. I know it sounds like linguistic jujitsu, but it's important. That's different than saying, if we do this one thing, we're going to do steps not 2 through 20, and then everything's going to be horrible. That is the slippery slope. It's that we can't stop these other steps from then happening is the fallacy. Because again, there's lots of cases in our history where just the U.S., where we started down a road and went, no, and changed course. Examples, we've had presidents, for example, that only served 1 term. Been several in the course of our history. We started down a road and went, nope, went a different way. There's been laws that we passed that later we repealed. All right. Policies that companies have implemented that later came back and said, bad idea. So we can always change course. And the slippery slope doesn't really take into account that ability of people to realize this is not good and change course. And that's why it's considered a fallacy. Now, our next to last one is what we call the appeal to tradition. Now, the appeal to tradition often will sound like this. So I understand that here at this company, this school, whatever, I understand that you all do this. That's pretty cool. Why do you do it that way? Well, because it's tradition. Oh, well, that's kind of cool. Well, why is it tradition? Because it's how we've always done it. Right, I get that. But why have you always done it that way? Oh, because it's tradition. Get the circular loop here? The appeal to tradition is tradition for just tradition's sake winds up being the justification for an action. All right. And that's not a reason. Now, I want to be clear here. If it is a tradition because it has a history of working, that's different. Okay. Case in point, I spent 4 years in the United States Marine Corps right out of high school. My grandfather served in the Marine Corps during World War II. Now, when I graduated from boot camp and him and my mom picked me up and we're in the car leaving, he starts asking me, did I have to do this? Did I have to do this? Did I have to do this? And I was surprised at how many things he had to do in 1941 that I had to do, and I know I'm aging myself here, but in 1994. And later on, I had a supervisor who used to be a DI. I asked him about that stuff, and the answer was because it works. We do something this way because we've never had it produces consistently the results we want. We've never, like we had to do something a certain way on the grenade range. They've never had a fatality on the grenade range. That's why. So that's not an appeal to tradition, right? That's an appeal to effectiveness, okay? The appeal to tradition is when the only justification for doing something a certain way is because it's tradition and that's it. Not it's tradition because it works and here's the track record. Okay, so that's the difference there. And then our last one is kind of the flip side of appeal to tradition, which is the appeal to novelty. This is arguing that because something is the new way, it's automatically better. And it kind of sounds, so we're going to be doing what now? Oh, we're changing this process to this. Okay, why are we doing that? Because it's the new way. Got that. But why? Why is it the new way? We're like, what efficiency does it improve? Well, it's the new way. So it's automatically better. You see the problem? Being new does not mean better. It can be. Nothing wrong with updating something. There can be lots of reasons why doing something a new way could be more effective. Cuts down on fraud, waste, and abuse, is more effective, produces better results. Great. But when the only justification is the newness of itself, that's when you run into this logical fallacy. Something I'm sure some of you might be able to relate to. You ever had a job someplace and your boss or a supervisor goes to some conference and they learn this brand new technique and they come back and they want to change everything because, oh, this is the new way. And then you try doing it and it doesn't work right. Or then 3 weeks, she goes back to doing it the way you used to do it because it worked better. Yeah, you just fell victim to the appeal of novelty. Okay, so new can be better, but not always. You need evidence, again, to demonstrate why this new way is better. What better results is it going to produce? And just because it's new doesn't guarantee that at all. So those are the basic logical fallacies that you need to watch out for when you are building your arguments with evidence and reasoning. I know they may sound simple, but every single one of us, myself as included, is guilty at one point or another in falling victim to these because often they can sound legit and they just tend to make sense. But if those fundamental issues are there, it is still not an effective argument. It still suffers from that fundamental premise that is flawed. So keep these in mind, make sure you stay away from them, have the evidence you need, and then you can make great arguments that don't fall victim to any of these logical fallacies.